So here are my thoughts on the Three Kingdoms fiasco. I'm not going to pretend like I've spent a ridiculous amount of time on this game because I simply haven't. I haven't quite even hit the 50-hour mark yet. In fact, it's one of my least played Total War games ever. I don't play Three Kingdoms. I haven't for many, many months at this point. I think it's really quite good. I think it's some of the best work Creative Assembly have ever done on the campaign map side in terms of the spy system and diplomacy and politicking in general, but it just ended up not really being my thing. I couldn't get into it. Played a couple campaigns, enjoyed my time, and then I peaced out. But Creative Assembly woke up yesterday and they chose violence, releasing a rather poorly thought out piece of communication, a video titled The Future of Total War Three Kingdoms. But of course that was misleading because it wasn't about the future of the game. It was an announcement telling everyone that it was officially dead. You can see the like-dislike ratio there. People clearly weren't happy, so they had to change the title. Whole thing was kind of like a doctor coming up to you and saying, "You have stage 4 glioblastoma. Something must be wrong with your medulla oblongata. Let's talk about your future. We're gonna take you out back and we're gonna shoot you, effective immediately, because you have no hope of survival. That is your future." Like, what? That's not a future, dude. You can just put Three Kingdoms down like a dog. It doesn't have a future, it's dead. Now, they did clarify that they're working on a new 3K game that will not connect to the first, but that raises a lot more questions than answers, and CA seems entirely unready to address any of them. Which begs the question, what the hell were they thinking? It doesn't take a PR genius to know that canceling any and all support for the fastest selling Total War game of all time, maybe the best selling Total War game of all time, halfway through its life cycle, would not be received well. So, if you're gonna do that, you need to have something of substance to cushion that blow. And the video they released yesterday, that ain't it, Chief. It's pretty straightforward. Don't announce you're killing a game until you're ready to actually talk about what you're planning on doing to replace it. No one was even expecting Three Kingdoms news right now. It's not like the peasants were at the gates ready to burn the castle down. They had plenty of time to come up with a decent strategy that would at least partially assuage the public's fears and frustrations after this announcement. Instead, they didn't seem to really have much of a plan at all. They dropped a nuke on the game and had nothing of substance whatsoever to talk about afterwards. In response, they're getting review bombed on Steam. There's talk of Korean and Chinese communities trying to mass refund. There's backlash on forums and YouTube and Reddit and every other venue you could possibly think of, and it's markedly clear they've hurt customer relations here. So CA's gonna be all like, this is what we get for communicating. We finally share info with people and this is how they react. But this isn't the kind of communication people want, and that should be fairly self-explanatory. If you've got bad news and want to dress it up to make it sound not so bad, have something of substance ready to discuss. And if you're not ready to talk about the sequel yet, don't say you're dropping support for the game until you are. So people are wondering, why should I buy this sequel about the exact same time period that won't connect or carry over any of the content I already own for a game that sold incredibly well and is barely only 2 years old? Why should I invest in a future 3K title when you promised a northern expansion with the Zhongnu tribes and that never materialized? Why should I invest in this future ephemeral 3K title when you guys didn't even get many of the watershed moments that made Three Kingdoms in the actual game? How is that even gonna work? Honestly, like, are they going to do another Nanman DLC for the next game? Are they going to do another World Betrayed? Are they going to have all the content people already paid for ready to go on day one? Or are we literally just retreading the same ground for a game that's already good and just needs some additional polish and patching? Even if it's not a full $60 expansion and it's, say, $30, why would people want to invest in that if they can't carry over all the stuff they already bought from game one? I don't know. I don't know that Creative Assembly knows either. And even though I don't play 3K, this is a situation I can absolutely empathize with because I know there are tons of people who care as deeply about Total War Three Kingdoms as I do about the Total War Warhammer trilogy. I would be heartbroken if they decided to pull the plug on Warhammer 3 halfway through its life cycle because some DLCs didn't sell well, before they got to many of the most important moments and characters of the setting. Like, okay, I get it. The DLCs didn't cover their costs or make enough profit for the bigwigs to think continuing support was worth it. From a business perspective, I understand that. If you've released 4 or 5 major patches with DLC and free LC and quality of life updates and people aren't continuing to buy them, then I can see why a business would be discouraged from wanting to create more. But that doesn't excuse the refusal to continue patching major bugs, it doesn't excuse dropping support for the game entirely. And the reason many of the DLCs didn't sell well is very much self-inflicted. The first DLC after launch was 8 Princes, which made no goddamn sense whatsoever. You're trying to create a cohesive narrative around the Three Kingdoms period and add all the epic battles and characters into a super cool, well fleshed out campaign, and then your first expansion is set almost a century later with none of the same characters, factions, or events related to the title of your game? Of course that didn't sell well. It's not an iconic setting. It's a completely different time period that doesn't tie into the main campaign in any way, shape, or form. That's a lesson Creative Assembly should have already learned from Warhammer with the Wood Elves and Beastmen mini-campaigns. They had already long since dropped those from the docket because people only want those kind of expansions after the main experience has run its course and is truly well fleshed out, which couldn't possibly have happened given what was available at launch and that 8 Princes was the first major DLC after release. I'm sure people would love a War of the Beard expansion between the Dwarfs and High Elves or some of those conflicts from previous eras, but obviously there'd be a ton of backlash towards that idea if they chose to release it before we even got Alariel or Belegar or any number of major races in the current setting. It just doesn't make any sense. And one of the only major complaints about 3K after a pretty fantastic launch was that it was just kind of lacking a lot of the conflicts and characters that make the setting special. No Red Cliffs, no Guandu, no Rise of Wei, no Northern Tribes, no Xiongnu, no Korea, a super empty southern portion of the map, and obviously no Nanman until many months after release. In fact, it was more like a year and a half. The actual Three Kingdoms split isn't even available either. And when you compare the value propositions of DLC released for Warhammer and the DLC released for 3K, it's pretty clear what wins out here. A World Betrayed and Fates Divided are not interesting DLCs. They focus on characters we've had access to since the beginning. My first campaign ever was with Lu Bu as Dong Zhuo's faction. I played that in pre-release before 3K was even available to the public. Why would I want to go out and buy a DLC that just gives Lu Bu a new mechanic and a couple new units? When in Warhammer, I could spend the same amount of money and get entirely new legendary lords with unique star positions, crazy monsters, tons of unique gameplay styles, and so on. The value proposition there just doesn't add up. It's not to say they didn't release good DLCs for 3K, they just took way too long to do so and focused on the wrong stuff first. So it kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth when they choose to tackle unattractive moments and then use that as the reason for why they can't support the game anymore. That is mostly self-inflicted. More people would buy if you do the iconic stuff first. And look, it's clearly a business decision. They weren't covering their costs with sales from the DLC and post-launch support, so the higher-ups decided to pull the plug. Okay, but this whole thing is avoided if at the very least they commit to ironing out some of the bugs and problems still plaguing campaign. And the blow really would have been softened, and the backlash would have been pretty subdued if this news came with a final DLC and free LC update. A big one, to send 3K out with a bang, and not a whimper. And now, they've alienated a huge portion of their Korean player base, a huge portion of their Chinese player base, which, by the way, is a big reason why they wanted to make Three Kingdoms in the first place, to tap into those new markets and make a hell of a lot of money from all those people. And it just feels like a lot of the great work and goodwill they generated over the years or two from an awesome strategy game has been thrown to the wayside in favor of short-term profits. That's dumb. It would not cost some obscene amount of money to keep a skeleton crew delivering 1 or 2 final patches to at least ensure 3K is in as good a shape as possible before they move on. We've heard nothing but financial success after financial success from Creative Assembly over the last 3 years. They're now the biggest games developer in the UK. They bought up Crytek Black Sea and rolled them under their wing. They even made so much money from Epic exclusivity that they were willing to give Troy away for free because they'd already made their bag. We know Warhammer DLC sells like hotcakes. We know Warhammer 3 was at the very top of Steam's best-selling games, and 3K was their fastest-selling and possibly their best-selling Total War title ever. And now you're telling me you can't even release minor patches or bug fixes to continue supporting it for at least a little bit longer? It's weak. It's a bad look, and ultimately, I think it's short-sighted. There are going to be consumers who are entirely put off from the series forever now because of a move like this one. The whole thing was just handled super poorly, and frankly, I don't know what they were thinking.